The sexual harassment complaint against Eastern Cape Judge President Selby Mbenenge returns to the Judicial Conduct Tribunal of the Judicial Service Commission, and that will happen tomorrow after about 3 months of a break in those hearings. That hearing will resume tomorrow, as I say, and to take that conversation forward, I'm joined by Mbekezeli Benjamin, who is from Judges Matter. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining me, Mbekezeli. So there was this week or 2 weeks, I believe it was 2 weeks of hearings that we had 3 weeks ago, 3 months ago. We're now back. What are your expectations of how this process will continue to unravel the allegations leveled against Judge Mbenenge?
Good afternoon to us and good afternoon to the viewers. You're quite right. Initially, the hearing was set down for 2 weeks, and they dealt with the evidence of the complainant, Ms. Mengo. And it was extensive and quite detailed at some parts. She was also cross-examined during those earlier 2 weeks in February. So this time around, the tribunal now shifts to some of the evidence that the Judge President will lead in his defense, including some of the witnesses that he will call up to testify on his behalf. We're not entirely sure whether he will testify himself, and we do hope that he will testify and explain the circumstances, because ultimately this tribunal is a judicial conduct tribunal. So it looks at the conduct of the judge, and so we're hoping that he will be given that opportunity to explain himself.
Yeah, and how important is it that we hear from him? Because there was a lot of focus, as you say, and a lot of detail came out of it, Mbekezeli, by way of text messages that were exchanged between himself and the staffer in the court where he was, and just that whole grappling with dynamics of power between himself and this administrator in the office there in the court in the Eastern Cape. So how important will it be for us to hear from him? Because there's a sense in which there was a bit of a debate about what kind of a relationship was really at play between the two of them.
I think it's precisely why we need to hear his version of events, because regardless of the nature of the relationship, ultimately, this tribunal is about judicial conduct. It assesses whether he has behaved himself according to the standards that are set in the Code of Conduct for Judges, including the requirement to act honorably, both in your public role as a judge, but also in your private affairs or in your private life. And so it does call on him to give some sort of explanation. What happened? What led to these kinds of conversations? What led to these interactions in the court, outside of court? We are really in the dark. So far, we've heard one version from the complainant. That version has been tested through cross-examination, which has also opened its own questions. And so we need the judge to explain himself and also to explain the circumstances of what happened exactly.
Before the whole process started, Mbekezeli, there was concern from the chairperson of the Judicial Conduct Tribunal about its potential impact, the potential impact of some of the salacious and scandalous details that would be emerging. And indeed, even after the concerns about privacy and the likes were waived by Judge Mbenenge himself, and we ended up with a fully open hearing, a lot of those details came forward, and many people were shocked by those. When you weigh up those concerns, those initial concerns, against the potential benefit of having it in public in the manner that it did, as detailed as it turned out to be, and as scandalous and salacious as it turned out to be, where does the balance lie? Are we better off for having had it in public the way that we did, or could it have been handled differently?
Look, you're quite right, Tulas. It's a very difficult balance to strike. It's very, very difficult situation, which we were hoping would never happen actually in the judiciary, but we are here now. Look, we are, Judges Matter is a transparency project, and so we advocate for more transparency than less. In this situation, it was important that these proceedings are in public, are open to the public. First of all, because of the circumstances of the allegations that are made, right? It is an allegation by a junior staff member against one of the most senior judges in the whole country, and certainly the most senior judge in that province. And so those dynamics are important for people to understand, because one of the fortunate things that have come out through this is there's now an open discussion about sexual harassment, the circumstances of sexual harassment in the workplace in particular, and particularly in the legal community, because for many, many years there have been whispers and people didn't really get a sense that there was any action being taken. And a lot of people in the 2 weeks that the tribunal was sitting in February, a lot of people did come out to say, look, I didn't realize that actually some of the conduct that I experienced was sexual harassment, in fact, and perhaps now I have a different view of that. Some have even said they intend to lay complaints and take action around those things. Others have said that they, even though they do understand that it was sexual harassment at the time, but they are not willing to take formal action, but they will request assistance for psychological help and other forms of support. So it was important ultimately. I think the public benefited from having this in public. Yes, some of the details are shocking, and maybe that shock factor, I don't know how it could have been avoided, but I think it was a necessary process for us to see this play out in public.
And where does this process that we've undertaken almost in a public manner in which it has forced a reckoning with this phenomenon of sexual harassment and the judiciary reckoning with that, where does that leave us in the broader conversation? And I think I've asked you this question before, that even in the interviews that the current Chief Justice participated in, at various points for the DCJ position and eventually for Chief Justice position, the whole issue of finally having a policy around sexual harassment in the judiciary was always front and center and a main priority for her.
Well, Tulas, you are spot on to say that it is a moment of reckoning for the legal community. Over the last 3 months, there have been some action that has been taken to deal with the phenomenon, with the scourge of sexual harassment. I know that the sexual harassment policy is now at an advanced stage of being drafted, and they're now finalizing those details, which is really important. The other thing is I've attended 2 conferences now. The first was the Women Judges Conference in early April. And there, sexual harassment and the discussion of GBV was front and center. Last weekend, NADEL, the Lawyers Association, also had an annual general meeting. Sexual harassment was front and center in that discussion. And so what this has done really is force the legal community to really, really grapple with the phenomenon of sexual harassment and try to set up systems to deal with it. Of course, the proof is in the pudding, and we do hope that this momentum continues so that we see many more people being protected, regardless of what gender they are. But no one should be harmed in the workplace, especially in this way. And so we are hoping that this process does open that up. But the other thing, I think more narrowly, this tribunal, I think, set an important precedent for the kinds of conduct that would be acceptable and unacceptable in a judicial context. Like I said, the judicial conduct is much more wider than simply sexual harassment. You could possibly be found not guilty of sexual harassment, but you certainly could be found guilty of judicial misconduct because there's a higher standard for judges. And so this process will also answer those questions about where are the lines when it comes to judicial ethics.
All right, I've got to thank you for your time, and let's leave it there for this afternoon. That's Mbekezeli Benjamin from Judges Matter weighing in on that issue. The hearings that are coming back, they'll be starting again, starting from tomorrow, into the sexual harassment complaint laid against Judge Selby Mbenenge.